You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
Amanda was on a trip with her husband. They'd been married for 14 years and they were attempting to reconnect. It was a work trip for him, but she was tagging along because it had been a rough few years and they needed some couple time. But instead of rekindling their marriage, Amanda met her soulmate. And in that instant, her whole world changed. Just not in the way she expected.
Through those various conversations throughout the evening, I just recognised that there was a depth of connection that I hadn't felt before.
From Mamamia, I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter. Amanda Trenfield has written a book about her experience. It's a memoir called When a Soulmate Says No. And in the title, you'll hear there's a bit of a spoiler about how this story turned out. But actually her story is about a lot more than falling in love with a soulmate who said no. It's also about what happened after that. And funnily enough, how it all ended up making some people on the internet absolutely furious. Here's my conversation with Amanda Trenfield. Amanda, tell me about the night that you met Jason in detail, as much detail as you remember.
I remember quite a lot of detail, Mia. So I went on a conference over to Western Australia with my husband because we had become quite distant. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to reconnect.
How long had you been married?
We had been together for 14 years and had a successful relationship. But we had, as I mentioned, become distant. And I thought, a few days away from the children, from our careers and from everyday life would be a terrific idea. And so we jumped on the plane. And my expectation was really just to have a wonderful few days in the vineyards, beautiful wines, beautiful meals, and reconnect. And it was at the conference, however, the first night actually at the dinner, that we sat down and I looked across the table and I immediately lost my breath.
Why did you lose your breath? What did you see?
So I saw a man across the table who I had met 12 years prior to that, and I just felt I knew him. And so through the course of the evening, we had a great, number of conversations, and my husband didn't.
How did you have conversations? Wasn't he sitting at another table? Did you try to find a way to go and talk to him?
No, it was actually one big long table with lots of couples and lots of people on the one table. And so he was sat down opposite me and just sort of, chatted over the course of the dinner. And my husband was sitting to my left and he had quickly engaged in conversation with another couple, and it just left the opportunity for me to get to know this man again.
What did you talk about?
To be honest, I'm not really sure. It just seemed to flow. The conversation just seemed to be very easy and enjoyable.
Was it flirty?
No, I don't really think it was at that stage. It was just a really open conversation.
Sometimes when you meet someone new, there's chemistry and you feel a bit of a flutter. I know when I was single, it used to make me a bit try hard. I used to get a bit sort of overexcited and speak a bit too loud or, laugh a bit too much. Did you feel that, or did it feel a different way?
It actually felt different. It just felt very genuine and very unique, and an experience that I honestly hadn't had before, where I could just really feel I could be myself right from the start of that conversation that evening.
And how was it different to just, you can be at an event and you just get on really well with someone and maybe it was a woman across the table from you, or how was it different to just a friendship or just an enjoyable conversation?
Well, I think as the evening progressed, it sort of became more and more obvious. So perhaps not quite at the restaurant, but I knew that by the time we left the restaurant, before we headed back to the hotel, that there was a real connection there. And when we got back to the hotel, I saw him at the bar and he bought my husband and I a drink. And it happened to be a glass of my favourite rosé, so I was very happy. And we just stayed talking. And it was during the course of that evening where we would mingle with other people, of course. It was a very large conference, but always find a way to come back together And so through those various conversations throughout the evening, which stretched into the early morning, which is really unusual for me, I just recognised that there was a depth of connection that I hadn't felt before.
Did you sort of ever refer to it, either of you?
The evening?
No, the fact that there was something going on.
That sort of happened the next day. And so we said goodnight early in the morning, and I went to breakfast the next morning. I could see him at another table, and I knew I needed to connect with him again before he left. And so after breakfast, I rang his room and said, would you like to have a conversation? And he said yes. And so a few minutes later, he came to my hotel room and he turned up in a T-shirt and jeans, and it was very cold. And I said, we're going for a walk. And we did.
So when you say it was very cold and he turned up in a T-shirt and jeans, do you think he was up for sex?
Look, I can't speak.
Oh, you said come to my hotel room. Where was your husband?
He had already gone to the conference.
Okay.
And so, look, it didn't cross my mind actually that was on the cards, and it certainly wouldn't have been something I would have entertained in any case. And there was no expectation from him or nothing that he said that gave me that impression either. So we went for a walk into the beautiful Western Australian bushland, and that's when we sort of connected. And I remember it very well. I opened the conversation with something like, I felt really strange and connected with you last night, and I just needed to know that I feel quite nervous with you. And a few steps along the bush track, he said, I feel the same way. And that's how our conversation started the next morning.
Did you know if he was married, had a partner?
I didn't know any of that, and that information wasn't forthcoming that morning of our walk. He obviously knew I was married, and I didn't ask.
Were you worried about being seen together going off on that walk, even though nothing had happened?
I don't think I was thinking at all, to be honest. I just really wanted to see him again and be in his company. And so, no, I wasn't really worried about anybody else at that time.
So you went for your walk, and then what happened?
So we found somewhere to sit side by side on my purple puffer jacket and started the conversation. And it became very clear very quickly that we were both not sure what to say. And the connection for me was just so acute at this time. And so the conversation was quite intense, and it surprised, I think, both of us at the level of connection. And I just remember so clearly looking into his eyes and just feeling that I was home.
When you say it was intense, what do you mean?
My whole body was reacting to him, and it wasn't just a sexual reaction. It was the way I first thought about it was an out-of-body experience, but as I really reflected, it was really an in-body experience, and it was coming from a place well within me, and I recognised over time it was coming from a soul space, not a hormonal space, not just a flirtatious space, but I felt a real connection with this man that I had never felt with anyone before.
What made you feel that connection? Was it how he looked? Was it the way he spoke? Was it what he said?
I think it was all of the above, but more than anything, it was the feeling. It was the feeling in my soul that I had met someone and have a connection with this person that I'd never experienced before in my life. And I couldn't articulate the feelings or the sensations or the in-body experience, but I just knew it was so different. And I knew it felt so comfortable, and I really felt like I was at home.
So what happened on the puffer jacket?
This poor puffer jacket.
That's not a leading question. Was the puffer jacket incriminated in the course of this situation?
We did share a few kisses, Mia. Yes, we did. And I instigated that, and I said to him, I think you should kiss me. And he replied, just kiss you? And I said, yes, that's all I'm capable of right now. And we kissed, and I was home, and I really felt home for the first time in my life. And as soon as we broke apart, the very first words out of his mouth was, oh no.
Why?
Well, he recognised the connection as well.
And oh no, because you're married.
Perhaps. He didn't extrapolate on that. It was just an oh no.
Did you just go back to kissing after that?
We did some more talking, and we held hands and we touched legs, and yes, we kissed a few more times, absolutely.
And did you sort of think to yourself or say to him, so what next? Like, was your mind straight away to the future and, oh, what do we do now? When can I see you again?
Actually, that came from him. He actually said, what are we going to do about this? and I didn't have an answer for him. I had not expected to meet anyone. I had gone with the intention of reconnecting with my husband and then was literally thrown a curveball. And so when we parted that morning, we didn't make any plans to see each other again. We just said goodbye. And I knew when I said goodbye to him that I never wanted to utter that word to him for the rest of my life. And walking back by myself to my hotel room, I knew my whole world had changed. I couldn't understand it, how it would unfold in the moment, but I knew that I had fundamentally changed.
How did you feel you changed?
I knew I couldn't continue to live the life I was living, and that became more and more apparent over the next few days as I re-entered my normal life back in Sydney. And I had a thought that perhaps he was going to change my life, and I couldn't quite see how it was going to unfold, but that is exactly what happened over the coming few months.
Just not in the way you expected.
Just not in the way I expected.
When you saw your husband again for the first time after you'd said goodbye to Jason that morning, how did you feel?
Confused, hurt, worried, and distressed, to be honest, but also not quite there. I was living in an alternative reality already by then, recognising that things were going to change, and I couldn't see all the steps that were going to be involved, but I knew in my heart and in my soul that my life was about to change.
Did the thought of being intimate with your husband, holding his hand, talking about your future, how did that feel?
It was more of a partnership by this stage in any case, and so that wasn't really on the table for us. And so that part of life had sort of disappeared already. And so, yes, it changed, but I think we went back to our normal lives pretty quickly.
When did you realise that your marriage was over?
Within the next few weeks, it really dawned on me that my marriage was over. And then, of course, I had to have that incredibly difficult conversation with him. And that was one of the hardest and most heartbreaking parts of my life because, he didn't deserve this and he didn't ask for this. But I also recognised I had to be authentic to myself and my feelings and respectful of him and the union that we had shared for so many years as well. And so it would have been completely disrespectful to him had I continued to play happy families when, I knew in my heart and in my soul I was no longer home in our marriage. And so it was up to me to have that incredibly challenging conversation, and I did a few weeks after meeting Jason. So having had no conversations or any communication with Jason, I knew I had to do the right thing by myself and my husband and let him know that our marriage was over before even reaching out to Jason to see if there was an opportunity with him at all.
If you hadn't have met Jason that weekend, what do you think would have happened in your marriage? Because you'd gone there to reconnect. So obviously there were still some embers there.
What would have happened? Look, I think we would have probably continued to grow apart, to be honest. This wasn't the first time that we had gone away to try and reconnect. We had tried a few months earlier. And so it sort of felt like, perhaps this is not meant to be because the reconnections hadn't happened. And so that was what it was, to be honest.
In most cases, when a marriage ends, one partner gets there before the other. Were you ahead of your husband at that stage?
I believe I was, but when we had the conversation, there was an immediate acceptance and resignation from him. And he didn't fight for us, and he didn't fight for me, and he didn't fight for our connection. And so just with that one conversation, and hindsight's wonderful, but within that conversation, I recognised pretty quickly it was already over for him too, but I don't think he would have necessarily called it. And, to be honest, would I have called it in that, next couple of months? Probably not. Life was good. We had a great partnership. We had a nice home. We had 2 beautiful girls. We had very busy careers and we were good friends, and we would enjoy each other's company. It was just the romance had died, but that's not usually enough to break up a marriage and to break up a family. It certainly had to be more than that for me.
And the more than that, was it Jason himself or just knowing that depth of feeling was out there and not inside the marriage?
100%. I'll choose B on that one. And that is because it wasn't, if I could have such strong feelings for another person, you know, it wasn't fair to stay in the marriage, and it wasn't fair to my husband. And it wasn't fair to me, because if that sort of level of connection exists in the world, don't you want to go after it and see if it's real and see if you can, you know, change your life for the better and be with someone who perhaps is more aligned with who you are.
How come you hadn't had contact with Jason when you came home? Like, were you not jumping on social media, doing a light stalk?
I'm not big on social media. And so, no, I didn't. And again, you know, my values would never have allowed me to reach out to Jason without going inside first, recognising how I was genuinely feeling, and then working through. And I had to work through the question, you know, would I separate from my husband if Jason said no? And the answer was yes. And so regardless of Jason's answer, I knew I had to separate from my husband, because that was the right thing to do for both of us, not just for me but for him. Because it also meant, by us staying in a marriage that perhaps wasn't meant to be continued in the future, he couldn't also move on with someone who may be a better fit for the next stage of his life. And so I made the deliberate decision that I needed to have this conversation with my husband first before reaching out to Jason, which is what happened.
How old were the girls at the time?
4 and 6.
And then you had to go on holidays.
We did. So
How'd that go?
That was a challenge. It was certainly not the holiday that we had planned and were looking forward to just a few months earlier. So this was a holiday that was pre-planned, pre-booked and prepaid. And it was only 5 weeks after the Margaret River experience.
And a week after you'd said this marriage is over.
Correct.
Did you not consider maybe, I don't know.
Not going?
Well, or holding out just a few more weeks until you got back?
Look, I'm sure at the time I did. It's been a few years now. But I actually offered to stay home. I said, look, you take the girls. And he said, no, they're really excited that we're all going together as a family. And we were actually travelling with 2 other families from the neighbourhood. And only one of the families even knew of the separation, because it was so recent. We hadn't even had a chance to tell the other family that we had separated before we got on the plane. I remember being up in Ubud with the second family who didn't know.
Because you went to Bali.
We went to Bali, yeah. And we had a fabulous 8-hour lunch. And we both looked at each other. Brad, my ex-husband, and that was the name he chose. I said, you know, what would you like to be in the book?
Yeah.
What would you like to be known as? He said, Brad. Call me Brad. I said, okay, Brad, here you are. And so Brad and I went to lunch with another couple, and it was a beautiful restaurant, and it was a large, long degustation lunch. And we looked at each other and I said, not today. And he goes, no, let's not do it today. And so we just enjoyed the lunch as a foursome and then told them the next day. And at first they thought we were going to announce that we were pregnant, and then they worried because they thought, hang on, we just drank a huge amount of cocktails the day before. I said, no, that's not the news.
I mean, the first thing that people want to know is, but why? What did you say when people said, oh, you know, like, we're separating? They're like, but why? Because your couple friends straight away, I imagine, what does this say about us, and compare themselves. What reason did you give?
At that time, just that we had grown apart and that we had decided that we're great friends, but the marriage wouldn't continue. And that was all we needed to say. And I think most people were quite shocked, because from the outside looking in, you know, we were a fabulous couple and we still are fabulous friends. It's just the relationship had ended. And so we were truthful, but we didn't extrapolate on the story.
And I mean, you know, we're having a laugh about it now all these years later, but it must have been incredibly painful knowing that you were hurting this person that you loved, looking at your children, knowing that the family wasn't going to be in the same shape that it had been until that point. I can't imagine how painful it was at that time. And knowing what was on the other side was still pretty unknown.
It was heartbreaking. And actually the hardest part of all of this was not only separating from my husband, but worrying about the children, because, you know, they're gorgeous little girls, and I had just made a decision that was going to affect the rest of their life. But I made this decision recognising that, you know, he and I were such good friends that we could absolutely make this work for them. And from day one, they were our absolute priority. And during the course of that Bali holiday, you know, we had a few arguments around child custody arrangements and asset splits. But at the end of the day, and very quickly, we recognised that, you know, the children come first. We would take 50-50 care of them. And we still do that to this day. In fact, we have a family dinner together every week or two, the 4 of us. to make sure that they're not trying to get away with something at one house and not at the other, but also so they can see that we are absolutely still their parents and we are co-parenting them and that we are always on the same page. And so that's particularly important as they get older, that, you know, they recognise that they are loved and cared for from both of their parents equally. In fact, last night we went to an Austrian restaurant for dinner, the four of us, because we've decided that we're going to introduce the girls to global cuisines, given it's so hard to travel outside of Australia most of the time.
When you had that conversation with Brad and said, what did you say? Like, what did you actually say? Did you tell him about Jason? Did he say, is there someone else?
He didn't ask the question. When we had the conversation about why, I asked, did you see it unfolding? And he just looked at me and said, who? So he hadn't seen it. He had already been quite disengaged from our relationship, because for me it felt like I was in a room of hundreds of people and there was a spotlight just coming down on Jason and I'm like, how did you miss that? Like, for me it was all encompassing. But for him, no, he didn't see it at all. He didn't even know who I was referring to when I first raised him.
How did you explain it to Brad? Did you say, I've fallen in love with someone else?
I just said I met someone that made me recognise that staying in this relationship is not in my best and highest good, and therefore not for you either. And he agreed.
After the break, Amanda explains what happened after she reached out to her soulmate to tell him that she'd just left her husband. And his response is going to surprise you. You're not going to want to miss this. So you're back from Bali.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since you told Brad, have you been like, I've got to tell Jason I'm free now?
Well, I did reach out to Jason after the conversation with Brad. And
what'd you say?
I let him know that my husband and I had separated and that he was the catalyst, and I was actually going to be near his hometown for a family funeral. And so I reached out to see if he would like to see me.
Was that true?
Yes, it was true, yeah. And he said he would love to and asked when I would be available. And then the next morning I got an email from him saying, actually, I think it's best if we don't catch up and we don't stay in touch.
Oh.
And that was when the soulmate said no.
I don't even know what to ask. Where were you when you got that message? Was it an email?
It was an email, yes. I was in the office, actually, and I couldn't breathe. Because even the email the day before was, yeah, I'd love to see you. When are you going to be available? Let me know as your plans firm up and what days and times.
And what had you imagined would then happen when you saw him? Like, of course, I imagine you would have imagined a future. What did you imagine would happen?
I really wanted to reconnect to see if his feelings for me mirrored my feelings for him. I wanted to desperately know if that time and place in the Margaret River was as real for him as it was for me. And, you know, in my soul, I know it was. He was absolutely there in those moments. He was there in that connection. He felt the kiss like I felt the kiss. But he decided to say no, and he decided to move forward with his life without looking back, and he has free choice, and I had to honour that. But it was incredibly painful because, yes, I mean, the Amanda of growing up in a society of Disney, Hollywood, happily ever afters, of course imagined that this was going to turn out in my favour, or at least in a way that, we expect as young girls.
Had you thought about, okay, so I'll be a single mum, I'll travel, where will I live, the imagined future with Jason?
Yes, I think our minds can go there pretty quickly. Yeah, you can imagine the house and the kids and everything. Yeah, absolutely. I indulged in those fantasies, absolutely.
And then you opened that email. You couldn't breathe. Then what happened?
Well, I went. I mean, I still went away, and he didn't contact me. He knew where I was and that I'd be there. That
you were nearby.
And I remember very clearly sitting in the airport with my parents after that trip, which was obviously emotionally challenging as well, going up for a family friend's funeral, and just thinking, wow, he didn't contact me. And it just made me wonder, was it just me in the energy? Did I imagine it? Had I lost my mind? Was I crazy? I've asked myself those questions many times over the last few years. But no, I'm not crazy. You know, I'm a pretty logical, down-to-earth person, and I know how I felt in that energy, and just perhaps it wasn't meant to be him, but he was meant to be my catalyst to course correct a life that wasn't going in the direction it needed to.
You say that now, having accepted it. At the time, did you think he'll come around?
I did. I'm a Scorpio and I'm very stubborn. So absolutely, I thought, how could you let this sort of a connection go? How often? You know, for me, it felt like a 1 in a million soulmate connection. You don't let that stuff go. You know, you embrace it with all of your heart and your soul. And it took me quite a long time, embarrassingly so, to really come to the realisation that his decision was not changing. And it was me who had to reorient my life again and put the focus back on me.
Did you want answers, reasons, talking, communication?
I did. I wanted all of the above. But also I have a level of confidence and self-pride that I wasn't going to be the chaser. I had to look at his email, I had to read the correspondence, and I had to honour the fact that he was saying he didn't want to continue. He didn't want to pursue this with me. So I did reach out again. And
how long after?
10 months.
10 months after he said no, or 10 months after you met?
10 months after we met. And, by that stage, Brad and I had very amicably separated. The kids were moving between the two homes. I had a wonderful apartment overlooking Sydney Heads. My career was back on track after those really challenging few months. My friendships had, there's a chapter in the book called The Changing Landscape of Friendships, where some friendships strengthened, some were released, and some new people came into my life, which is fabulous. And so life was looking really good. I was fitter, I was healthier, I was enjoying myself, I was enjoying my job, I was enjoying the girls and our time together, but I still hadn't been able to let the connection rest because I'd never felt anything like this before. And so I was still quite incredulous that we still weren't living in soulmate bliss. And so again, very stubborn Amanda, reached out one more time. But I was strong enough at that stage that if the answer was still no, I knew I'd be okay. And I couldn't reach out before then because I couldn't guarantee that I would be. And so I had to wait. I had to wait until I knew in my heart I was strong enough.
Did you think to yourself, he will feel very pressured. He met me. I've left my husband, 2 little kids. Is he going to think that I'm going to turn up on his doorstep with suitcases and toddlers? Did you think, I've scared him off, I'll just give it a bit more time? But when I come back to him, because the email that you wrote to him 10 months later was very much, hey, I just want you to know my life is great. I'm all good. There's no pressure. However,
but
that soulmate thing.
It hasn't gone away.
P.S. Call me. And how did he reply to that?
I thought he was happy and in a relationship. And by then I'm like, okay, Amanda, you have to let this rest.
Were you embarrassed?
Oh, a little bit of me was embarrassed, absolutely. Because again, I'm not normally the vulnerable one in relationships. I've usually got it together and I had never been that vulnerable person in my life. But I really did open up to him because I thought it was worth fighting for. And so fight I did.
Do you think he'd been in a relationship all the way through?
I can't confirm that. I don't know. He didn't mention it at the...
You didn't do any... You're not good with the light stalking and the Googling.
No, I'm really not. I didn't have Instagram until September last year.
Okay. You can find out a lot of things on Facebook.
Yes, yeah. Look, that's not really who I am either. And, I didn't want to pressure him clearly, and I needed to really put the focus and attention on the girls, number 1, my career, number 2, and my self-worth.
But Amanda, there's this man you're a soulmate with. You had this incredible connection. He's behaving in a way that's not in the plan.
Not in my plan.
We made in our heads. What about your curiosity and just wanting to know, but why? Like, weren't you looking for an explanation as to how he could deny this connection? Didn't you need a story to tell yourself?
I did, but I didn't get it. I didn't get it from him. And that's been one of the hardest parts because I still, and I'll be really open and honest in the book, and I sort of say, am I crazy? Have I had this out-of-body experience? Have I lost my mind? And I know I haven't. And yeah, I'd love some more answers. So, Jason, if you're listening, happy to have a conversation. But look, I'm not holding out for that at all.
Does he know you've written this book?
He was one of the first to receive it. So I actually sent it to him before it was released onto the market.
What did he say?
He wrote me an email the next day and said, Amanda, it's an excellent book and you should be very proud of yourself and congratulations. And I'm still reading that email going, seriously? It's like, it's about you, right?
All the very best. Well done.
Yeah, I sent him a bottle of wine and a nice glass so he could enjoy reading the book.
So just reaching out, just in case?
No, it wasn't about that at all. It was, I had let him know that I thought I might write a book about my experience.
Was he terrified?
He didn't say he was. No, he said, okay, that sounds terrific. And I said, if I ever do write it and publish it, I'll make sure you get the first copy. And he said, I'd appreciate that. And so that's what I did. I honoured my commitment to him, which was made years earlier, and I sent it to him in April of this year.
When I was younger and a lot of my friends were dating, they used to tell me about a type of guy who I've actually gone out with too, called a self-startler, they ended up calling him. And it was like a relationship accelerator, a guy who sort of was very early on, I think sometimes they call it love bombing now, but it's slightly different to that, who would talk about the future, who talk about, I want you to meet my mum and, all of these sort of things. And then suddenly they just ghost you. Mm-hmm. And suddenly they just put the brakes on. And it seems like in a very short, accelerated period of time, that's what he did. He was like, yes, I'm here with you. This is amazing. And then just actually no. He scared himself. Is that sort of how you think of it?
And again, I can't speak on his behalf, but for me, I think that the connection would have startled him as much as it did me, absolutely. And I think you have two choices then. You run toward it or you run away from it. I ran toward it.
Over the next period of time, one of your friends said to you, the best thing to do is to find another guy, to jump back on the horse, whatever, take your mind off it. What was your experience of dating after that? Tell me about some of those guys, Aiden and is it Tim?
And Luke.
And Luke. Tell me about them.
So all very different experiences. Aiden I met when I was away, when I was travelling for work, at a random bar, as you do when you're sitting up at the bar and having some drinks and some dinner. And we just had a great conversation, and it was around the time that I had just met Jason. So it was first just great to have a male's perspective on what had just happened. And when I recounted my story with Aiden, he sort of looked at me a little incredulously at the start, but then by the end of my story, he just looked at me and said, you've got to chase this. This is worth it. So he was absolutely saying, yeah, I think you've met him too. So off you go. And then Luke came along, and I'd known Luke for many, many years. And again, that was sort of, a missed opportunity many, many years ago. So I sort of thought it was interesting to catch up with him. And, we shared a few wines and had a few conversations, and that was not going to go anywhere anyway either. And then there was a bit of internet dating in there, and that was a disaster for me. So I'm not sure about your listeners and how much success they've had, but for me, it didn't really work.
Why didn't it work?
I didn't find that communication style easy. I was on Bumble. I didn't like having to make the first move and start these conversations. And
you've got to be good at banter.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is not easy for everybody.
No, I'm much more of an in-person person, and I'll get a really good feeling for someone pretty quickly in aura, and so that really didn't work out for me. And there's a great story in the book around my girlfriends and I were having a lovely lunch up at Palm Beach, and they were very excited to see who I'd matched with on Bumble, and so I handed my phone over, as you have to. And one of the men that I had been chatting with, my girlfriend just looked at me and gasped, and I said, okay, what's going on? And she said, well, that's actually the ex-husband of a friend of mine. And I said, well, that's okay. I'm an ex-wife. Tell me more. And then she went on to tell me that he was actually living with another woman at the time, of which, of course, I hadn't met him at that stage, but I very quickly confronted him with this information, and he very quickly deleted himself from Bumble.
Oh, dear.
And so that sort of put a bit of a sour taste in my mouth as well, and I sort of thought, wow, really? So I sort of closed down the app. And to be honest, what I recognised through that experience of being on the dating apps was that, perhaps I wasn't ready and that I needed to do some more work on myself. And so for me, a lot of my journey, the journey really is not about Jason. The journey is about coming back to myself and honouring who I am and understanding who I am for a long time. And to do that, you've got to go through a lot of self-healing, and it can be really painful. And so it starts with simple things like journaling and yoga and music and drinking too much, which was my coping mechanism. But then over time, it broadened, and it broadened into understanding more esoteric concepts like spirituality, and that was really important for me. And then energy healing and travel and And along this period of time, I've really learned so much about myself that I'm much more capable, confident, and more self-assured than I've been in a long time. And it really took Jason as my catalyst to get me to this stage of this incredible self-awareness, self-confidence, and also self-trust.
Did you have to go through a phase of grieving the end of your marriage and grieving a relationship that you never even had with Jason, but the prospect of that relationship? Did you have to burn through all those different layers of grief?
Absolutely. So grief is a huge part of a healing process. And I think until you are forced into really assessing who you are and doing that hard, deep inner work, you can fly along the surface of life for many, many years until something hits you and says, no, you've got to go and do some real work. So the grief was absolute and it was all consuming. And it was, yes, the grief of the end of a marriage, and it was the grief of not having my happily ever after in the way I thought I would have it. And it took time. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of alone time to sit with myself and to sit with these feelings and to work through them. And it was incredibly painful. But had I not been forced into that, I don't know, would I have done it in this lifetime? Perhaps not.
When did you stop looking for that soulmate connection at that high bar that you found with Jason? Or have you not stopped looking for it?
I've stopped looking for it. I believe that if there is a soulmate connection that's right for me, we will find each other. And I'm very relaxed in that now. I'm really confident and capable in who I am as a woman now. I feel empowered. I've changed my careers since meeting Jason, and I'm now helping other women through their own transformations themselves. Having been through a pretty huge transformation myself, not only on the personal side, but then on the professional side, having left my 20-year financial services career. So I've done a lot of transforming in the last 5 years. And so I love now helping other women through theirs. That gives me a huge amount of joy.
Where is your romantic life, your soul life at as we sit here today?
So I'm happy in my soul. I'm feeling really content, and I'm looking forward to my future. And I am looking forward to welcoming in another soul at the right time. And if he comes along, fantastic. And if he doesn't, as I said, I'm really happy with the way I have rebuilt my life over the last few years.
It's a beautiful story. How old were you when you met Jason?
41.
And how many years ago was that?
5 years ago.
It's a beautiful story.
Thank you, Mia.
Oh, that's a story and a half. But there's actually a whole other part to this conversation. That's the story of Amanda and the soulmate that said no. But in part 2 of this episode, exclusive to Mamamia subscribers, Amanda talked about what happened when an excerpt of her book was published in a newspaper, and it also was online, and it went viral. It was discovered by Twitter, who absolutely tore it and her apart in a way that you just won't believe.
Before I was thinking too much about it, I did see a few headlines, and it was the most challenging couple of weeks of my life, I'll be honest.
You can listen to that episode right now if you just follow the links in our show notes. Thank you, if you are already a subscriber to Mamamia, for supporting women's media. And you can buy Amanda Trenfield's book, When a Soulmate Says No. There's a link for that too in the show notes. The assistant producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson. The exec producer is Lady Boss of Podcasts, Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and thank you for having me in your ears.